of course. Now, our focus on SEND continues the committee's interest in the council's work as a corporate parent, and it comes hot on the heels of an Ofsted inspection of our SEND provision. Whilst the inspector's report will follow in the coming months, it is a good thing that the committee can engage with the issue today. The committee has frequently made the point over the years that we need to have a nuanced understanding of the communities we serve, and this item provides an opportunity for members of the committee to be involved in policy development rather than just pre-decision scrutiny. Now, the way the meeting will work this evening is that I, as chair, will be running the meeting, and I will be inviting people to speak. I will allow every member of the committee who wishes to speak the opportunity to do so. So I would like to ask members to wait their turn and not interrupt when people are talking or comment on the contributions of others, except during their own statement. Throughout my tenure as chair, I have sought to emphasise the importance of courteous scrutiny and respectful decision. Tonight's meeting is no different. I wish this to be a courteous, polite meeting, even if there are things that we don't agree upon. As part of this, may I remind all members that in accordance with the Constitution, when I speak during debate, any members speaking at the time must stop speaking, and so must all others. Further, if any member persistently disregards my ruling as chair by behaving improperly, offensively, or by disrupting business, I may move for them not to be heard any further at all. Do members understand my wish for courtesy this evening? Good. I would also like to remind members that the Overview and Scrutiny Committee, that whilst we are here to look at a number of important matters this evening, our debate and comments should not be adversarial in nature, either against Cabinet members or any other members. We will also need to be mindful of the requirements for respect when speaking or asking questions to officers in accordance with the Member Officer Protocol. We are here to express our opinions on the merits or otherwise of the agenda items before us and try to come to a collective view, or failing that, a majority view. As I have said before in a different meeting, I would also ask members to bear in mind throughout the meeting the need for Overview and Scrutiny members to act as a critical friend to the Cabinet. We are here to try and help the Cabinet and therefore the Council overall to make better decisions, and we must do that in the spirit of friendship. Now, I intend to use the following procedure. I shall invite the relevant member, or where relevant, the officer, to introduce the report. I will then invite members of the committee to ask questions of that member or officer. I shall then invite members to express their views as part of the debate on the report. And I would like to remind members, again, that I shall give everyone who wishes the chance to speak to do so. But in accordance with the Council rules of debate, you will only be allowed to speak once at the discussion stage. If you hear something said by someone else that you dislike or disagree with, you do not have the right to comment after they have spoken or interrupt them. Please say everything that you wish to say in your allocated time. I shall then speak, and we will briefly sum up the discussion and advise of any issues or common ground to note. And that's the process that we're going to use this evening. Right, all of that is now done and dusted. Sorry, that always seems rather long for all of you, I'm sure. Now, I'd just like to see, we've received apologies this evening from Councillor Lukey and from Komal Chowdhury. Councillor, anything else? And and Councillor Mishisho, yes. Okay. Right, so we are all quorate, so the meeting can go ahead. I was starting to wonder if we were going to run out tonight, but so far so good. Right, I'd like to say, are there any declarations of interest or any communications from anybody? No? Okay. Right, let's get started. If you've all have a look at your agenda, please, which I hope everybody has received. Okay. So today we actually have 3 sets of minutes for approval on the agenda, and I'm definitely not going to be going through all of them, and I'm sure you wouldn't wish me to do so. We have the minutes from the 16th of September 2021, the 9th of November 2021, and the 1st of February 2022.
I formally move all 3, Chair.
Thank you. Yes, has anybody? Yes, Councillor Bidoff.
Could I just say that I think they're extremely well done and very comprehensive, and I think it really adds value to the record of this committee to have individual comments attributed to people. So thank you very much for that hard work.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so anybody got any matters for accuracy, or we're all good to go? Everybody in agreement? Great, thank you. Okay, now we are finally at agenda item 3, a very, very important item, the SEND service inspection activity. So we're considering 2 substantial items tonight, and the first of these is the SEND inspection activity. As I have said already, we all have a role to play in being a good corporate parent. The Council provides a range of support to children with special educational needs and disabilities, and we have just received an inspection from Ofsted. So today is a very good opportunity to understand more about the service and its performance. I'm sure Councillor Bruce will appreciate contributions from the committee on this important issue. We should also remember that the report asks the committee to note 3 things. 1, that a SEND inspection has taken place, the Council's SEND self-assessment, and the outcome of an Ofsted inspection of the Westbrook short break unit. Therefore, in accordance with the process I mentioned previously, I would like to welcome Councillor Tom Bruce, Cabinet Member for Education, Children and Youth Services, and Stephen Forbes, Executive Director for Children's and Adult Services, to this meeting. Councillor Bruce, can I ask you to introduce the report? And you've got 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. Hopefully I won't take all of that time. Starting with what you just said, Chair, yes, I certainly, both of us and the Cabinet certainly welcome any comments that the Overview and Scrutiny Committee have to make on both of these issues. I'll start with the last one, actually, as it appears first in the report, which is the Westbrook Short Breaks Unit. 3.1 in the report here outlines what the Westbrook Short Break Unit does and is for, and just under that outlines what Ofsted found when they visited in December, which is outstanding, an outstanding grade in all 3 areas, which I am incredibly proud of, and the Council should be incredibly proud of. It's a very important service that gives support to some extremely vulnerable young people, children and younger adults as well. So support for their families and support with them transitioning into adulthood and being able to make that leap forward. The report, the inspection report itself, explains a little bit more about what the short break unit does and also outlines the 3 areas, the outstanding areas of judgment. To highlight, I'd just like to highlight a couple of comments made by parents that is on page 3 of the report, 74 of the agenda this evening. One parent said, "This is a second home for my child," and another said, "I know that my child is loved there. Staff give warm and loving care." I mean, if it's good enough for Ofsted to report that, it's certainly good enough for me to repeat it here this evening. I won't go over to say any more about that. I'm happy to hear questions in a minute. The second area is the SEND area inspection. In the report, in the committee report here, the agenda is the self-evaluation. Now, I think you may have said this, apologies if I'm repeating this, but the judgment is embargoed at the moment. So I know what has happened, and Stephen and senior leaders know what happened, but publicly it is embargoed. When that is reported and published officially in a month or 6 weeks or so's time, obviously, you know, it is welcome for everybody to read and see. The self-assessment that's in here gives a clear indication of how we view the service going forward. And the strengths and weaknesses of what there are. There are many strengths. I said to the inspectors when we met with them on the first day of the inspection that they will find a lot of really good things here, and I know they did. They will find a lot of dedicated staff here, which I know they did. But they will also find areas that we need to improve, areas that we know we need to improve, and those are outlined in that self-assessment there. And also, we are able to demonstrate through that how we are going to achieve those changes and how we're going to make it better going forward. I'll hand over to Stephen, if that's all right.
Thank you, Councillor Bruce. Thank you, Chair. I won't focus very much on the self-evaluation because I assume that members will have lots of questions. So I'd rather allow time for that. I do, however, want to actually focus on the Westbrook inspection. And the bit I want to focus on is that in my long career, I have fundamentally always believed that that word that is in the report, which is one that we're not often allowed to use in care, which is love, is quite important. And I put the credit for that, not for myself, not for the service managers, but for Rachel Ann Ooman, who's the registered manager of Westbrook, who exudes her passion and love and care for the children there and encourages her staff to do that. And I think if nothing else, I would ask you as a committee to recognise that single officer's contribution to creating a service which is loved by many that actually use it. So at that point, I would stop, Chair, just recognising Rachel Ann's contribution.
Thank you. That's wonderful to hear. I would just a point you were saying is that you realise in the self-assessment that there's area for improvement. I mean, even as a parent, we're always striving to improve because we don't get it right, you know, even when they're adults. So, and it's wonderful that you have somebody leading such a wonderful, you know, making people feel loved, especially children with those needs. Would anybody like to start the questioning? Councillor Mlal.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I feel that there are three areas of the council activities where there's a lot of sensitivity looked after children in terms of our corporate parenting responsibilities, looking after frail and elderly, and another key area is the children's SEND services. Now, on the Westbrook short break unit itself, outstanding results, fantastic. Simple question, do we need more places for this outstanding service in terms of capacity issues? Do we need more places for it? Because it seems to be doing very, very well, and maybe there's a more of a demand for it. That's a simple one. Park that to one side. And then on the SEND, again, I found the self-evaluation very, very transparent and frank and honest. And clearly, I agree with Councillor Bruce in terms of the strengths in the document and also the areas perhaps where we need to do a little bit more work on. And in specifically looking at that in more detail, I'm concerned that the inconsistency across the borough of assessments, it came up in the report, and how we can make a reduction in the variability of those kind of assessments. Which leads me on to the other question, is that in the report it says that the numbers are high and higher compared to neighbouring statistical comparators sort of thing. Could it be that because of this variability in assessment that we are getting higher than average EHCs, education healthcare plans being knocked out, etc.? I'll hold on for that for time being.
Shall I start on the, I mean, in terms of places, it is something that we've talked about a number of times. I think it's one of those things that what you don't want to do is build somewhere or create more places and them to be underutilized. It currently does fulfill a niche in the borough, a particular thing that we need. It would be easy to say, oh, wouldn't it be great if there was more of it? But that's not necessarily the case. I think actually it could not, you know, it might not necessarily be the case. I think getting the outstanding grade and the position that they are in, also with looking at how actually, not just in terms of creating more places, but potentially capital we might spend either on the building or building a new place. I think now is probably the right time to be thinking about a number of those things, you know, updating the building, because it is a bit tired. I'll be perfectly frank. You know, 2 or 3 times I've visited, I absolutely agree with Stephen. I mean, it is a wonderful place, and it's such a great energy when you go in, but it could do with updating somewhat, or a new building, and also can be looking at places. So there isn't a plan, a fully formed plan at the moment, but it is something that we're thinking about.
So to pick up on your comments about the variability and the number of EHCPs, so there would be some evidence that the needs of our community would suggest that we may have a slightly above average level of EHCP need, some evidence. I think there are then, and What I'm going to try and avoid doing tonight is getting into the complexity of the SENS system, because the SENS system, and we've just had this conversation, is an unbelievably complex system. But there are probably some factors about how we flow the money through schools and through what's called the high needs block, which covers, so we get about £6 to £8 million out of the schools block for high needs. So how we flow that money with schools that might, in essence, come back at us about encouraging the perceived route to getting more resource is to achieve an EHCP. Now, I think an EHCP is a good thing when it's necessary. It's not a good thing where you could have potentially met the needs of the child at a pre-HCP level. But if the perception is often and frequently that the way you get access to additional resource is by getting through the HCP threshold, we certainly have more requests for EHCPs than I feel comfortable with. So one of the things we've got to do, and I often talk with Councillor Bruce about, we're turning an oil tank around here, is to change the perception of why you would come forward for an EHCP, and is it the only way you can access resources, or could you actually get resources in before you get to an EHCP level? So we've got a bit of a cultural and process shift to do there, I think, to reduce some of the numbers.
Just to add, I mean, just on the back of that, one of the things that does happen in schools is that a child and a family want this EHCP for a number of months or even a couple of years. That's the sort of, in a sense, the end goal. And once they get that, apart from this idea of the money being slightly different and more being spent, actually fundamentally in school, nothing changes. The provision was there for that child. Things were in place because the school is doing a really good job for the child. But it seems as though that's the thing that matters. And changing that culture, looking at it in a different way and trying to provide greater opportunities for access to the money without having to have that EHCP is a really important point going forward, and should have an impact on what you're just saying.
Thank you, Tom. Anybody else like to ask any questions? Councillor Biddulph?
Thank you very much. Got questions on two. I think you were carrying on, though. Have I interrupted you? You had more questions, didn't you? Okay, all right, thanks. I've got two main points. One is on the paper that we've received, and one is on the more general approach. I'm a little concerned. The paper seems very rushed, and I don't know if that's the case, but there isn't anything under key implications. There isn't anything under risk management, and one of the risks surely is losing the high report you've got, the high standards you've met, and there isn't anything under equalities, which I know is not what normally happens these days. It's just 8.1, include equalities impact information here. If there aren't any impacts, we need to know that, and I'm sure that there are some impacts. So that's just a comment on what has been given to the committee. What I'm concerned about in terms of the paper overall, or the presentations overall, there seems to me to be at a transition with quite a lot of disruption potentially. You've got, you're in a discovery phase for refreshing the Children's and Young People's Plan. There's a revised government arrangements are being looked at. The strategy now requires updating. And I would just like some reassurance, or at least draw it to your attention, that the service must continue without that sort of disruption coming through. And when you have a new proposal or policy, it's implemented in a way that doesn't affect particularly parents who are looking after children, say at home, but also obviously children that we look after ourselves and in whichever setting they're in. Concerned about the reserves point, which needs to be addressed, I think. And I don't know if all councillors received the email from a resident about an EHCP that was taking an awful lot of time, but that's not the first example I've seen of families who are in a state of limbo for an awful long time when the EHCP doesn't seem to be coming forward. And we've got casework that correlates with that. So I'm concerned about that too. And what can we do to speed up the production of EHCPs and then the monitoring of EHCPs and the revising of EHCPs so that parents feel supported rather than at sea? Thank you. And just one final point about parents, which is those I've met are exhausted after the pandemic, teaching at home, for example, and I don't know what we can do to help them. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Biddulph. Who's going to take that, Tom or Stephen?
I'm sure we can do a double act.
You go ahead.
Can you just clarify what your comment on the reserves? Are you talking about?
Well, unless I've misunderstood it, there's a point in the report that says you're in negative reserves.
You're
which is
talking about the
being addressed.
deficit for the high needs block. Is that the bit you're talking about? Right.
Yes.
Just to clarify that.
Yeah.
So in terms of the report, I mean, in terms of the key implications, I mean, I suppose there could have been some things in there. I think the self-evaluation kind of, I hope it kind of speaks for itself and talks about what the situation is rather than laying it out there. There's quite a substantial number of points in there and about how we're taking that going forward. So I'm imagining that is why it hasn't been put there. It didn't really affect my reading of it when I read it, but I take your point. Perhaps that would have been more helpful for you when reading that. So I appreciate that. In terms of timescale, and there's a couple of number of points that you mentioned there. You're absolutely right. There are EHCPs with particular families and children that take a long time. You've had casework. I get lots of casework, and I get it from members, members as well as the stuff that comes straight to me. It is a case that that happens. They have improved, and I mean, it's talked about in here. I can't remember exactly which page that we've got the third highest improvement in the country, or in London, one of those in the country, in terms of time scale. So that's a really important factor, that there were issues with the timeliness. They have been and are being sorted out, and wherever they are, need to continue to improve. I mean, until they're at 100% for that timeliness, we will keep working on that and then maintain that 100%. So I acknowledge that there are issues, and it's that there are complex cases. I mean, the one I think you're alluding to is a very complex case with lots of things going on, and that's not an excuse to say, oh, no way could it have been done in that time. That family, I think, should be getting a better service than they're getting, and there are others. I accept that. But there are lots of complex cases with lots of need from lots of areas, and lots of need and lots of input from lots of areas that just need working through. One of the issues that we know we need to be working on is that communication, making sure that family and families like that one know what's happening and are not being left in limbo. And I think that's really important. And that is acknowledged here, and I'm certainly happy to acknowledge it this evening and to say that. There was a couple of other things. Sorry, do you want to add anything?
So within the complex descent, the timescales are actually the easiest things to understand. There are three major timescales. The initial assessment, so we have legally 20 weeks to complete an initial assessment, from the request to undertake the assessment to concluding the plan. With exceptions, that can be extended, and I won't even try to describe what the exceptions are, but they would affect probably about anything up to 10% of the assessments. And then if the parents choose to disagree with the draft assessment, we then enter a appeals process and a re-review process, which can technically extend that 20 weeks almost indefinitely. So there will always be, when you said 100%, I went, there will always be a number, probably somewhere in the region about 10% of assessments that are not concluded by the 20-week because of exceptions or disagreement or whatever. Picking up what Councillor Bruce said, 3 years ago, our average assessment rate was 38% completed within 20 weeks. We're now averaging 86% completed within 20 weeks. I think difficulty, picking up what you've identified a bit of, is for a number of parents who were in the system, their experience was not a good one and is still a live experience for them. So it'll probably take us a couple of years for the good experience we're going through now in completion with 20 weeks to start influencing how people see the system. Next timeline is the phase transfers from early years to primary to secondary to further education. This year, for the first year, we achieved all phase transfers, and those are calendar days. There's 2 separate calendar days. We have to have agreed the transition point for the children, which school or education are going. All were met this year, and that's the first year we have achieved that. And again, we are now in a position we'll be able to sustain that. And the third timeline is the annual reviews, and that is the one area, if you see in the self-assessment, we've identified we need to continue to do more work, because that's a bit more complex about getting the process between schools and ourselves and the NHS to work more effectively to getting those reviews done within the annual cycle. So there is a big chunk of work to be done there. I think you're right to point out, I think, that we are in a bit of a transitional phase. There's a lot of change going on. I agree with you that one of the things we've got to do is make sure that underneath all of that, the day-to-day stuff goes on. So one of the things that Anita, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, and I do as the assistant director, is try to buffer the operational staff away from some of that systematic change, so it isn't interfering and then churning the stuff through. But some of the systematic change is about changing the way we work. So there will be areas where the performance will drop a little until we've got the change in place to make it work differently, and then hopefully we'll see the benefit. So that there will be a bit of disruption, but hopefully managed disruption. We're not changing things and then not aware that that change makes something happen. But there will be places. So when we did the phase transfers, it worked well as the outcome, but the process of transition was a bit stop-start. But we expected that, but we got to the end product. So I accept that, and I think that's a reasonable challenge. In terms of the deficit, we've also got the DSG, Dedicated School Grant Management Plan, because we were required to develop that 2 years ago with the Funding Skills Agency. That's up for review this year. That is a set of 7 mitigated actions we've put in the DSG management plan. It's published online, so I can certainly make that link available to you, which sets out the 7 key things we're going to do to tackle the deficit. So we had to project if we didn't do anything where the deficit would be in 5 years' time, and what are the actions we're going to take in. And the ESFA signed that off with us, and we'll review that again about how successful we are in changing those activities to take pressure out. And some of that is about lowering the number of EHCPs, managing where we're placing children, making sure our local schools can step up and take some of the more complex children that we're not going out to borough, for children being placed in schools which the cost is anything between 20 to 40% more than what we'd pay within the borough, and also reprofiling the flow of money for our own special schools to enable them to actually take on some more complexity as well. So there's a huge amount of activity in those areas trying to manage that deficit.
Sorry, Chair, just to jump back in, one of the other points you raised was about supporting families. And I mean, this is exactly what the short break service does. And I would encourage, anyone that or anyone listening, or anyone that any other councillors speak to, is to look at how those families can access the short breaks, talk to their dedicated officer, whether it's a social worker or whoever from the council, that might be able to have some input in the things they could do to mitigate some of that pressure. I mean, I absolutely know it as well. I've heard from lots of families over the last 2 years about how difficult they're finding it in difficult circumstances. And almost now it's, we're not at the end of COVID, but it perhaps in some respects to lots of people feels like we are. But for many families, they're still in a position where it's really, really tough. And those things that have happened to them over the last 2 years haven't suddenly gone away. They're still there. So, talking to officers, talking to the short break service about how they could access that to take some of that pressure off. But there's also, and we had the budget 2 weeks ago here, additional money that's going into areas, into schools, that can be used, will be used by those schools, not directly with families, but certainly, helping those young people in schools to get back on track, for want of a better phrase, that where they might be behind, and for whatever different reason, and not just children with SEND, but they will be included within that cohort as well. So there are a number of measures that we're already doing, and depending on what you might suggest at the end of this meeting, Councillor Biddulph, we're happy to look at and take forward.
Thank you both for that very detailed response. Have you got another question, or is it a comment? If it's a comment, can we wait until we've all done all the questions? Thank you. Councillor, okay, Councillor George, or?
Yes, I do. Thank you. Yeah, I have no doubt in you supporting families, and I have the faith you do it, because I have seen a lot of work happening in the background. However, I just want to ask what we could have done better, and what have we learned out of the experience? And were there any impediments? What kind of help or support you needed more?
Do you mean over the last 2 years of the pandemic, things that we could have improved? I mean, hindsight is a wonderful thing, isn't it? And I think It's interesting. It's a very similar question to actually what one the inspector asked me in that introductory meeting. I was asked, well, the room were asked about the barriers in place, and I did say the government and the lack of a change to a lack of response to the needs of the population and the changing needs of the population, and the SEN review that still we haven't got after numerous promises. And I'm not trying to be party political about it. I do genuinely think it's a really important aspect, and it's one thing we were talking about before we came into the meeting today, and what our hopes would be for that going forward. And it's a kind of, there is still a complexity to the EHCP process. Bringing the things together has been a very, very good thing. But actually, it hasn't fulfilled what I hoped the 2014 review would have. And it hasn't simplified it enough. It hasn't made it accessible enough to parents. I just don't think there's an understanding. If I don't have children with any SEND at the moment, if that happens in the future, I think I would be at a huge advantage, not only being a teacher, but also being immersed in this for the last 8 years. But I still don't really understand everything that goes on. So for someone who doesn't have that background that I do, how on earth are they being able to get involved in that? And that's the kind of thing. And that's what I think, not just the government, but that's what we need to do, is to be opening that up to families, making it much easier for them to understand how to navigate through a very complex system. And I think that's something that could have made a difference over the last couple of years. And in going forward, actually, being even more proactive than we are in talking to parents and talking to the families about what they find from the service, and how together we can make it easier going forward, because they've been immersed in it. The trouble is, what works for one family might not work for another family, might not work for another family. So it's coming to that collective view that a group of families, a large group of parents, can have about what the best thing for the borough is going forward, what the main priorities are. And I don't think we've done enough of that previously. So those are things I think we can certainly learn from. I don't know if you've got anything else.
I think a couple of specifics harking very much back to pandemic, where government made the decision that schools would stay open for vulnerable children, which I think was the right decision. I think the difficulty of that was at any one time nationally, and we were slightly above the national on most days, we saw something in the region of about 23% of those children who were identified as vulnerable attending school. So the resources to encourage those families to get their children to school were just not there. We were lucky, thankful, and opportunistic when Ofsted suspended its activities. They offered up inspectors. We took 2, and we focused them very much on liaising with schools and social workers to try and get children into school. So I think we'd used that time really well. But in hindsight, if we were ever faced with that again, one of the things I would say is, where are the hands and the people to encourage families to get their children into school? Because it's easy to open the school and run it. It's much more difficult to get families to get their children into school for lots of different reasons. And for the special schools particularly, given the needs of the children, the pure logistics of meeting pandemic safety requirements and transporting children back and forward just overran our ability and resources of fleet, vehicles, staff. So whereas we would have had a school run on a 16-seater minibus with potentially 8 children, we were down to potentially 1 or 2 children. So the fleet requirement was potentially anything. If we'd seen the number of children coming to school and going to special schools, we would have probably had to have a fleet available that there isn't out there. So the logistics of making that happen, therefore the question would be, if we were to find ourselves in that position again, what would be the resource for home-based schooling for children with special educational needs, which in itself is a significant challenge against home-based schooling for the majority of children who were able to access online. And I don't think there's an easy answer for one, but the logistics alone were a challenge in terms of getting children with oxygen, suction, you name it, into schools one at a time. just challenged our resource availability. And I don't think any local authority managed to get over that, because the numbers evidence that we didn't in terms of across England as a whole.
Thank you. Councillor, do you have a question or you're good? Okay, thank you. So we're finished with the questions. I would just like to ask if anybody has any comments to make, but if you do, could you please focus them on the recommendations on page 5 of the report, please? Would anybody like to go first? You? Yeah. Oh, should we have Councillor Foote? Yep. Or do you want to make a wait until you've heard them all and then?
No, all right, I'll wait.
Yep. Okay, Councillor Biddulph.
Thank you. I was going to raise the pandemic, which Councillor George has done. So that's been partly responded to, but I think it would be useful to have some kind of summary of lessons learned from the pandemic. You've obviously outlined a very important one there, but there were others too. I'm thinking in particular of somebody in my ward who needed some funding to enable her to be able to go to work so that her son could also be kept. I think he's quite very unindependent and needs an awful lot of support. And there was a feeling that the rule book was being read and there wasn't anything that we could do that was flexible. So I wonder if we need something like a flexible needs fund. I know that I'm talking about money, but something that, a pot of money that you can go to for extreme circumstances where the system isn't working. I also, that made me feel as well, a very important point made about love in the home, but I felt that there wasn't any sense that there was a human being at the end of that. And I'd quite like to see something that recognizes that at the end of the question being asked or the need that isn't being met is a very distraught, responsible parent who's trying to do the very best for his or her child in extreme circumstances. So I quite like to see something about that. And I don't know about the possibility of having a leaflet, maybe there is already, but a leaflet for families, parents, carers, telling them what they can access. And I know we don't want something that's hundreds of pages long in a very complex situation, but I didn't know about the short breaks, for example. Is there something that could be given to parents and to councillors?
Either of you? Well, if you. Oh, right.
Just to respond to Councillor Biddulph leaflet. So we have two things that are relevant. We have the Send service, which is the Send Information Advice service, which we're obliged to have as part of the Code of Practice. It's highly regarded by parents. I don't think all parents know about it, which is a challenge for us. But I think, again, that's not unique to Hounslow. There's always a proportion of parents know about the Send service, and there's always a proportion that don't. So anything that anybody can do to promote the presence of the Send service is a good thing, because it exists, it's there, and it meets the information, advice and advocacy needs for this cohort of parent carers. And we also have, as we're obliged to have by the Code of Practice, the local offer on the council's website, which is information about Send services and education, health and care plans. So again, I can send that to colleagues and they can send that out as part of it's there, it exists. Again, I think sometimes with this kind of service, you need to be in it to know it. And even then, sometimes in it, you don't know it. So anything that we can do through councillors and community groups to promote the Send service and the local offer on the website, more than welcome to do that. Really happy to promote that information.
Thank you. Yes, Councillor Biddulph.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Yes, it's just reminded me that many years ago I had as a client, and I've completely forgotten this, and I don't know why I didn't think about it earlier, a special school in somewhere in Surrey or Sussex, I can't remember now, and I was commissioned, I can't believe I'm saying this, to produce a pack for parents about all of the support that was available to their child, to them, on the ramifications of all of that. It was a folder. I accept that that is one discrete school for a limited number of pupils, students, whatever you want to call them. But something like that, seems to me that something like that is needed. A snapshot, who you should call was one of the important things, because a lot of parents didn't know exactly who was looking after their child, and the sorts of just highlights of what you can do. And I just wonder if there's something that we can do. I'm not hearing in what you've outlined exactly what I mean. So I just wonder if there is something else that could be looked at.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to take that away and look at that. I think that could be something that could be very useful. I mean, my initial response to that is, I think that could work, but there are lots of areas that could be. And the trouble is, I mean, it's a bit like going back to the code of practice from 2014. You know, it was well-meaning, but it's 600 pages long, and you could almost end up not with 600 pages, but something like that, where everything's lumped in, and it becomes confusing. I know. I'm sure there are ways of condensing that and making that a bit easier, and actually making sure families know exactly who to call or who to speak to and how to navigate through, making sure our communication is better, that we're getting back and sending, you know, there are numerous pathways that people need to navigate, making sure that's much clearer once it's known, well, what's the issue or issues and how are we going to go through that? And that could be something. So absolutely, we'll look at something that we can do.
It means looking at it from the parent's point of view. If I were a parent, what would I need to know? Not how much information we've got to distill. Yeah.
I think, you know, I mean, the pandemic, I mean, it was something that nobody ever sort of imagined would happen. So, I mean, yes, there are lots of things that we need to do, but hopefully we'll never have that experience again. But as you say, I mean, I worked for a little while with special young adults, and I would go home at the end of the day absolutely shattered. So the implications for a parent 24/7 is just awful. And I think we all remember the case recently in Ealing where a mother killed her child. I think was he 10 or 11, because she just couldn't take it. So, yeah. Councillor Foote, did you have any?
No, I was waiting to wrap up.
Okay. Councillor George?
No, I just want to, you know, there are always lessons to be learned and room for improvement. Just want to congratulate you because there's a lot of hard work happening in the background. So well done.
And yeah, Councillor Tuck?
Thank you, Chair. I'll echo what Councillor George has said. Congratulate the team in here. We've moved from the score we getting outstanding for the Westbrook. That's really incredible within 3 months. Looking at the support available to parents, we run a lot of schemes that parents can access to, but not all parents are aware of those. And most of the time, they don't find somebody who they can go to and ask, like, what is available to them, because I'm sure not all the counselors or in some cases, not a particular officer will be aware of all the schemes available. So if we can have a comprehensive document snapshot of each schemes available, or maybe a training to school staffs, because that's where the parents first go to and ask the teachers, like, where they can go and seek help for their kids. School will be the first place they go and ask to. So if there will be a training provided to school staff about the different schemes where they can advise to the parents, I guess that'll be something we can look into.
I'll answer that as well. I mean, in terms of schools, every school will have a SENCO. It's the only position in the school that a school must have, which is special educational needs coordinator. Often it's a very senior member of staff, assistant head or deputy head, perhaps. They are very connected with the council. The council do a lot of training with them, a lot of support. There are lots of conversations that happen, probably from the view of the SENCO, perhaps not as many as they would like, but there is a lot of activity that goes on around there. So if any families are not sure about what they can access, and you know, specifically thinking about the school, the SENCO is the person that they need to speak to at the school, because they will have the knowledge and the advice to be able to give. I don't know if there's anything else.
Just to add to what Councillor Bruce said there, and I would expect, and I think I can use that word loosely, that the SENCOs are aware of things like the Sendia service and the local offer and how to help parents navigate. I do think, however, given that it's one SENCO potentially in a mainstream school where you've got 800 pupils, their time is pushed. So probably not all the time are they reminding themselves to remind the parent that the CENDIAS service is there, and the local offer is there to guide them with information. So I think you're right, there's always a bit of retraining or reprioritising the information flow, because it's a big, cumbersome system that we just need to keep picking up what Councillor Biddle said. I spend my life inside that system. Lots of my officers spend their life inside that system. Parents spend their time in that system once. And it usually takes, in my experience over the years, has been it usually takes a lifetime of a child to get to master the system. And how we make that different for every new parent entering the system, I think, is a fundamental challenge about how do you get all that knowledge. So we have a parent carer forum locally. Part of my ask of them is that they support parents to help navigate through that, because that is the role of parent carer forums as voluntary organisations. But it's got a constant churn of people coming in out of the system, and how does the collective community knowledge carry forward all the time? And I think that's, for a new entrant, it's a daunting system. There is no doubt about it. It's a daunting system.
And just going back to Councillor George's point, I think you said about what about councillors? Yeah, what can councillors? I mean, it comes back to Councillor Biddle's point about that information for parents. I think information for councillors. We have had training. I've been here 12 years now, and I know each new administration there has been training on looked after children and what the SEN service means. But for us, it was 4 years ago. So, potentially in terms of a wider training for councillors. More frequently updated perhaps, and reminders about the things, because different councillors have different areas of interest and focus their areas in certain ways, and can forget about some of these other things, or one email 3 months ago, 6 months ago, 2 years ago is not necessarily going to be at the forefront of their mind. So we can look at that again, but as part of a wider thing for councillors.
Thank you. Councillor Lala, you've got nothing. Councillor Foot, we come to you.
Thank you. I'll keep it brief. I think, first of all, I welcome this. It's absolutely important for the children that are in these situations, but it's equally important to the parents and the siblings, so they get relief. So I see something like Westbrook as an absolute place where there is relief for the parents and the siblings as well. The other factor that's come out, and I was just, it's nudged in my mind that certainly during the time when my own children were at school, and now with my grandchildren at school, I find that the school staff are the first to experience any problem areas, and they're the ones who are likely to raise it. Whether I wasn't aware that they actually had a title, these people, Senkos, but it's always seemed to me that there's someone there who's going to come along and talk to a parent about whether there are some problems with their children, some quite minor, some more serious. So I think that that there is a process out there. It might not be as good as we would like it to be, but I think I take what Stephen was saying is the problem is massive, and to have the resources. I mean, most of my experiences have been with my youngest, when the children were really young, in first going into education, you get that feedback, and same with my granddaughters. For the actual abilities to actually deal with these problems, they are massive, but that it's not saying there isn't there, but it does need adding to, and I think that's where we would be. I don't know. Do you want me to move noting this? Yeah.
I think so.
I'll move that we note the reports with a lot of thank yous surrounding it to the staff in the area. I think we're indebted to them to a great deal.
Absolutely. Is everyone agreed? Thank you. Just like to say thank you for everything. Thank you, Councillor Bruce, for this evening. And Stephen, thank you to you and your team who do a marvellous, marvellous job. And really, none of us, or everybody, we just have no idea of the total amount of commitment and constant work that you're doing. So thank you so much. It's probably one of the most important departments Thank you once again. You are free to go if you wish, or you're more than welcome to spend the rest of the evening with us. Okay, thank you both. Okay, finally, agenda item 4. This is the process and approach to developing the Council's new equality, diversity and inclusion strategy. We're now going to receive a presentation from Councillors Khan and possibly Atherton, or she's here to support. And yeah, would you like to sort of get started? Okay, thank you.
So this is the way to liven up a meeting, right? Hear from the tech to tell us what to do. Thanks, Gary. Right, so we've got about 5 minutes. First of all, I'd like to give apologies for both Councillor Catherine Dunn, whose report this is, working with the senior team. She is unable to come, and also our deputy leader, who is also engaged somewhere else. So you're left with myself and Candice Atherton, who are by far as equal as our colleagues to present this report to you today. So moving on, so basically, what this is for you to consider and obviously give us some comments on the process as what we're doing to adopt this 4-year strategy that we have to do. And this is about how we're developing the equality and diversity and inclusion strategy for the next 4 years. And it's really important that we're discussing it also, that we should bring this to you over in Scrutiny and look about the process and the findings. So that's like the first opening slide, which I'll fly through. But actually on the 8th of Feb is when we kind of receive the report. And the key thing about that is looking at our ambitions and tackling the inequalities that we have already identified across the borough. Many members were involved in that as well. And the other key thing there is that we've adopted the LGA's framework for equality and diversity and inclusion, which also backs up as the Equalities Act of 2010. And there, when we look at what the authority is, that is where we have this new framework for governance. That is the key thing which we want to get your comments on and the process about as well. So it's quite a busy slide, but I'll try and make it a little bit easy for you to kind of understand. There's like all the arrows which are red down the left-hand side, and you've got the arrows on the top. So if you take the second arrow on the top where it says departmental SLT teams, you can see with my colleagues, you've got Mandy and Elliot and also Celia, who are very instrumental in organisation, quite high up, because that's the kind of first area of kind of the governance of which kicks in. This is the departmental and all the teams from all the departments, all the engagement, all the managers are all over this. And then you get the EDI strategic officer steering group, and that's where I mentioned Mandy and Elliot. They're the kind of the key leadership teams. And then you've got the EDI members work task force. And some of your colleagues were in that group, and many of our council colleagues were in a kind of developing our understanding of the disparities within the council. So that's where that comes in. And then we got corporate officers. These are many of our staff members who are equality officers, both looking at the LGBT side of things, the race side of things, and obviously the disabilities and trade people. And then that's across the top. And as you go down the bottom, you start seeing the roles of the governance that are coming in, and we'll delve into this deeper. And then you've got the different phases as well. There's 8 phases, which are really important, which is what was effectively presented to us at Cabinet. Moving on, because we only got a couple of minutes. And then really, you see it says draft ambitions, draft vision, draft aims. This is purely because we still have discussed this amongst ourselves. We're still going to go out to the residents, right? So, and this is where your kind of help comes in as well. And these, if you look at the first part where it talks about our ambitions to reduce the inequalities of our most important deprived and those who are left behind, this is where we spoke about the traffic light system, which we've already done massive amount of work. So just there you go. Look, it's the last kind of slide, and this is where I just wanted to ratify what I've said. Get Candice to also kind of, because she's been very heavily involved, like myself and Lily Bath and Catherine, in this whole EDI process. And just as we go and understand this more, I wanted Candice to say a couple of words as well, if that's okay.
Thank you, Councillor Khan. Yeah, so just to reiterate what has been said, we felt it was really important that this came to scrutiny this evening. So we've got the strategy that is going to be, it's going to be a process. The strategy is going to be written over a period of time, because we really recognise how important it is to consult with our community, but also with councillors, with also with staff. And so this won't be something that is perceived as rushed, and it's really important that the strategy and the delivery plan that is achieved will be really informed by really understanding the needs that we have. We've already done lots of work. We've got some brilliant data analysis available to us now. Lots of information has been already provided when we did the task force around tackling race equality. And we wanted to make sure that we, in the same way that we've done loads of work around tackling race equality, we're also looking at how we also tackle other inequalities that exist in the borough and in the council as well. We are going to be
5 minutes is nearly up. Sorry,
no, that's
Candice.
fine. I mean, Councillor Khan has said everything, so we just really want to make sure that we're being transparent, and we're making sure that there is accountability, and that will be formal and informal. Formal at meetings such as this, but also informally, we're making sure that equalities, diversity, and inclusion is at the forefront. When you are going to all of the committees and panels that you're involved in, and with all of our staff, that this is at the forefront of their minds. So it's just making sure that we really embed that in the strategy, so that we can achieve the outcomes that we're aiming to achieve.
Thank you, Councillor Atherton. I'd just like to say also thank you tonight to Mandy Skinner and to Elliot and to Celia Golden, who I should have said at the beginning, so apologies to all three of you. I would just like all of us here to consider, what we're here to sort of do this evening is consider and comment on the processes and approach to developing the Council's new equality, diversity, inclusion strategy. I would now like to ask if there are any questions to be asked. Councillor Lal.
Thank you, Chair. Right. I think over the years, I've seen several of these documents passing my way regarding equalities. Celia, right. So this strategy is more than welcome. It always needs a refresh, and there's some new angles in here. So we've adopted the LJ1, and hopefully it'll be up and running in the summer of this year, the new strategy. Now, just to give you a quick fire question, in the report, it does say that, I'll read it out. The analysis of data and gathering of evidence throughout the pandemic has highlighted communities disproportionately affected, and a clear picture of the impact is forming. Would you like to give us any examples?
Sure. First of all, I can start off. Obviously, I'll leave it to Celia and Elliot to go. We already know the inequalities across the borough, all the way from money in your pocket to overhousing to opportunities for children to aspire to go to school. We also know the internet connectivity. We addressed many of these. So the evidence work that you mentioned in the report is what we have been doing over the last, I think, since George Floyd's kind of incident that took place, is when we then instigated this whole new framework of getting members and senior members to come in and talk about and put a strategy together. Because obviously, you know yourself, the frontline workers were those who were affected the most. And why was that? Was that purely because they were lowly paid jobs that are doing all the work at the front? But it was much more about that. And that is exactly what we did through this research and evidence. And that is through the work and through the governance, and the new strategy is what we're doing. So there are many examples which I've given you already, but in terms of actually specific examples, I can ask Celia and Elliot to explain those. But this is what Candice Atherton was saying, is that this new approach, I know you said, Gamal Lal, you've seen quite a lot of these come through, but genuinely, we hadn't been through a pandemic prior to this, and the findings and the learnings and the evidence that's come through that is very different to what it's been previously. Hence why this whole strategy and what Candy said earlier, this is why we're going to bring this to you early. So before I bring in the office, I think Candice wants to say something as well, if that's okay.
Thank you. Oh, my mic's on. I think examples is really important, and two spring to my mind from the work that we did specifically around the pandemic. So one was that we all knew that the airport, the fact that the airport was sort of very much reduced. I think we all knew that that would have an impact. But I know that I definitely, when I think of the airport and airport workers, I would think about men. But actually what we discovered, that the people that were really, and that's just my lack of understanding, but what we discovered is that a lot of people that were significantly impacted around the airport was low paid women, and particularly ethnic minority women, so women that were at risk and losing their jobs. So knowing that and knowing it, then we know that we can really start to target and support and make sure we're upskilling and providing ways that women can look at new opportunities, look at possible career change, look at doing courses and study, etc. So it's really important that we have that data and we know who's been impacted. We also did some work around loneliness and social isolation. And from that, we discovered that a lot of young people were actually very lonely. Again, it might not be who you would automatically, when you ask who's lonely, who's isolated, especially for me working in adult social care, leading adult social care. But to know that it's a lot of, our young people, our teenagers and our young adults, and it means that we can focus our resources towards making sure, and young people is another area that we recognise face certain inequalities. So they're just two examples. I hope that helps.
Awesome. Celia?
So, Councillor, we did quite a lot of work on ward-based inequality. So something like 11 metrics were looked at, ranging from deprivation, unemployment and furlough stats, and educational outcomes, exclusion rates, digital connectivity, health inequality, stop and search, disproportionate custodial sentences, resident engagement, household living arrangement, debt, personal debt, were all a kind of basket of measures we looked at by ward, but also by neighbourhoods. And we then use that to identify where are the places where we need to look at targeting some of our interventions. And that's the basis of the first tranche of work we did last year in the wake of Black Lives Matter. But having said that, the work on place-based is not specifically about race. It is about all communities living in those places. And then we also looked at group-based things that affect inequalities affecting particular communities. So, for example, we looked at women and screening rates. We looked at child mortality. There were a number of factors we looked at which specifically identified target groups. A custodial sentence is one of those examples. It wasn't a place-based example where we looked at why young Black children were, tend to be more affected by the disproportionate number of them in custodial sentencing. And we're working with the magistrates, and because the key point is, so what? So we know this data, but we're working with the magistrates, the probation team, and parents, as well as those young people, to try and reduce that custodial sentence figure. And so there's a kind of very ambitious plan to now not think that that's outside our reach, simply because they're either poor children or because they are more vulnerable to drugs, or because parents are single parents and they're not around to protect some of those children. So we're actually working, very, very hard at trying to involve our parents to work with us, and the community organisations as well. So re-looking at mentoring, etc. So that there was a tranche of, very evidence-based approach that now changes and informs the next 4 years of our strategy. And that includes work with working class communities, as well as disability communities, as well as, young people, and all the 9 characteristics set out under the Equality Act. We're trying to make sure we can be ambitious enough not to just do one, but to cover all those. But in that process, having a good understanding of the different types and the different implications of those inequalities. I hope that answers the question, Councillor.
Thank you. Yes, carry on.
Yeah, that's very, very useful, if anything, in terms of giving a little bit more substance to what this refresh means and how detailed the analysis has gone into it. Am I right, Celia, in thinking that, so we have quite a lot of benchmark data, so come 2, 3, 4 years down the line, we can benchmark, this is what it was like X, and this is what it's like now, and we can see some kind of improvement. So we've got some substantial concrete data to benchmark against.
Yeah.
Census update.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. So there is also, we're waiting on the new census update to come in as well. That will give us better information, because a lot of the information is from different sources. Some of it is DWP, some of it is the NHS, some of it is, so it's as much about how we are able to get that data and then compare as well. So there will be an element of that, but we're hoping some information to be very well collected. And it's as good as whether the source collection is good as well. But local data, that's our own educational rates, exclusion rates, achievement rates, all of that is local. And that we can definitely put a marker in terms of comparator. It's when it's outside the council that it becomes harder to, pinpoint exactly. But we're very alert to that. So we'll be looking at what the metrics ought to be saying. And you're right, the metrics have to say, well, what's the difference we're making with this? So thank you, Councillor.
Thank you. Councillor Tuck and then Councillor Bidoff. Can we just keep it to the questions for now, please? Lovely, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I understand our borough is one of the most diverse borough we have in all of the London borough. And I'm sure council has been working in past as well to tackle the inequalities and bring everyone together. You just told us that during the pandemic, it were the ethnic minorities that were hit hardest among all the communities in our borough. So do we know the reason or root cause why only ethnic minorities were hit the hardest, and what preventive actions we are taking that it doesn't happen in future?
Sure, I'll let Celia answer that. But in terms of the inequalities, actually what we found, it obviously was at the beginning very much of the race type inequalities that came through. But actually when we started delving deeper, the 9 categories that Celia mentioned, many of those started coming through as well, with the age, with the sex, in terms of the example that Candice gave. But I'll let Celia explain that in more detail, because we do have the evidence, and that's exactly what we've been working on in this group.
Thank you, Councillor. So in terms of tackling race inequality, the Black Lives Matter campaign and the disproportionate deaths of COVID deaths highlighted a particular characteristic, which was on race. That isn't to say that that is disproportionate on all fronts of the metrics that I talked about. So, if you looked at disability, and you focused in on disability, there was no campaign and there was nothing else. But however, equally, they were also affected. Equally, COVID was as critical an impact on those communities as well. So I think it's just that we shone a light on race, and therefore, the ONS highlighted quite a lot of structural and systemic inequalities, such as multiple households where people live intergenerationally, and as a result of that, they were more prone and more vulnerable to COVID and more susceptible to, therefore, their mortality was higher than other communities. So that there was from the example of health alone, it's also about some of the living standards of some of those communities, whereas in the white community, social isolation is a bigger issue, because a lot of families live alone, elderly people live alone. So for us, it was looking at what's the issue, and it's not that race is disproportionately the highest inequality, it's what's the actual issue in which the different groups actually have different levels of inequality, and they're equally disproportionately affected. So I think it's a kind of misnomer that one group is more impacted. They are more impacted for COVID. They are more impacted around stop and search. And so it's really about what is the actual metrics that we're looking at. And in that case, we can have different disproportionality. Depending if you're looking at women's issues, they seem to be on a part-time working more so than say Black communities are. They are also in sectors where they're earning less. So it really does depend on what is the inequality that we're talking about before we can narrow down that one group is, disproportionately, universally disproportionately affected. And that isn't the picture that's emerging from the data sets. Thank you, Councillor. I hope I...
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that I wasn't saying that was our final finding, that it was the ethnic minority communities that were impacted the most, particularly when we were looking at who's impacted by, job losses at the airport. That's what we discovered, that it was women, and it was women on low pay. I think it's important to recognise that there's a lot of intersectionality as well. So, when you're talking about the Black community, and when you're talking about LGBT, when you're talking about the disabled community, lots of people are in, might sit in all three of those things. You've got women who are also disabled, who are also ethnic minorities, and they will have been impacted in lots of different ways. The Kevin Fenton report, though, from who did the report around public health, did find that there was definitely some findings that some of the reasons why there was inequality and disproportionality amongst ethnic minority groups was to do with people seeking help, maybe delaying to seek help. And so there is definitely work to do around people feeling that they can trust the health system, as much as some of our ethnic minority communities have distrust around policing and crime. There's also some of that distrust around health as well. So we're definitely learning a lot, and we're making sure that when we're looking at equalities, diversity, and inclusion, for example, I lead on public health, we're looking at how can we make sure that all groups feel that they can freely access, that they can go for screenings, that they're encouraged, that they're invited, that they're welcome, that they belong, etc. So but we're looking at this through all the different equality strands, and we're recognizing that they all intersect with each other.
So I'll just end on, this is one of the reasons why we've come actually to you, to make sure we can keep coming back to you to make sure we're actually going through this process as much as it is with everything else. Because in my opening slide, I talked about the direction and ambitions. We have to work with everyone to make sure we're following through. So I think that's also one of the key points we wanted to stress today as well. Did you want to say something as well? Yeah.
Just a couple of things, thank you. So the first one really is just trying to give examples of some of the issues that Celia raised, and a good place to start is with the community hub. So what the community hub really showed us were the residents and the people in the borough whose situations were so precarious that lockdown meant they were almost immediately overnight vulnerable. In terms of they needed the community hub, and it was something as straightforward as getting food to their home. Now, what we soon realized after having, initially with the community hub, it was just no questions asked, we'll get the food out the door. But actually, when we started to have deeper conversations with people about what their situation was, what Celia's just explained came to life really, because there were people from certain communities, tended to be white British, which was about isolation, didn't have a network with them, didn't live with family, suddenly could not get food, literally couldn't get it, couldn't access online shopping, needed something delivered. Other communities, such as the younger residents, maybe 18 to 25s, it was more of a financial situation that their work had ended overnight. In terms of the type of employment in, the sort of precarious nature of that meant they became suddenly vulnerable. So almost the solution, the immediate solution was the same for everyone, but the backstory was so different that's what took us on to start thinking about community solutions, and how the work that Celia is able to inform in terms of the ward inequalities work that's available for all members to see really can inform some of the interventions that we then design across the borough through the community solutions work. So it was a real moment where the inequalities, whatever they were, came to the front straight away, just overnight, really. The second piece is just something that you mentioned, Councillor Lal, in terms of seeing strategies like this before. What actually is, we haven't had a strategy before. That's one of the things. We've had sort of we've had policies We've had action plans, but we've never actually had a resident community focused strategy around this work that we do want the community to feel that they own and our partners own. Celia has had documents, like you say, and action plans, equalities and human rights policy 2017-21 all the time. And the work that we did on the racial inequality and the task force and the member task force, I remember sitting in a meeting with councillors Atherton, Khan, Dunn and Bath, and it was very much, we need a strategy. All the good stuff that's going on, all the stuff that we know, the information that we now know through the pandemic, through the racial inequality work, we need a strategy that the community and actually councillors can all buy into and treat as our own. So we do see this as very much not a document that's going to sit on the shelf. It is really complex, which is why actually we here at the start of the journey in developing strategy, not the start of the work, but we want really your thoughts on how we develop the strategy. We can talk about the issues that we're going to find out, that we know already, that we will consult on, but what we're really interested as well is actually how can we involve members through the journey? How can we involve the community through the journey? Have we got it right in terms of our phases? Does it look and feel right in terms of, at the end of that, do we think we'll have a robust strategy, or is there something missing? So really good to hear thoughts on that, as well as actually the issues, which are obviously important.
Thank you, Elliot. Councillor Biddulph, was it you next, I think? You'd wanted to ask a question.
Thank you, Jan. First of all, I think this is a really unsung department, and it's about time it was sung much more loudly and clearly, and I'm really pleased about this work, which I hope does bring it forward. I don't remember having any training on equalities and diversity when I was a new councillor. The pack, and I don't know if it was you who put the pack together, but the wards packs were phenomenally helpful and phenomenally interesting. And even if you've lived somewhere, as I had for 30-something years, there are things that you don't know about your own area. If you come in from the outside, you know even less. So I hate to think that I'm adding to your workload, but is there going to be training for new members on this subject and on this subject alone? Is that pack going to be brought up to date and changed, amended, so that new councillors and even existing councillors, if they're re-elected, are updated on that information? I haven't finished, but I can see you're bursting to answer.
I forget things. No, it's just that we've only, because we've been having conversations a lot lately about what the induction will look like for returning new members after May. And I know that everyone, certainly on this table and others, want equalities work to be at the front of that induction and really sort of prevalent, and not to create work, like you say, for when we talk about department, by the way, it's not much more than Celia.
I know,
but yes, I think there needs to be a commitment to keep that work as fresh and as up to date as possible, as because people are looking at it and using it, which is really great to hear.
Can I carry on?
Yes, you may.
Thank you very much. So thinking about the last point that you made previously and how you can progress this, as it were, with member involvement, and I don't necessarily want to tell you how to structure things, but do you have the scope for having a member panel or some kind of grouping where people are intensely involved in it and know exactly how you're developing, where your stages are? We've got the digital strategy one, for example, where we meet every so often or not. But I think people who are really interested in this would love to be involved in a much greater way as you develop it.
When the report came to us at Cabinet, one of the key things in there was to retain the working group and to develop that. Is that right? Yeah.
Yes, I think it was agreed at Cabinet that the task force would be re-established. But looking back at how that actually worked was then we had sessions with, I suppose, like you've just said, councillors who are particularly interested in the work, who committed to 4 or 5 sessions through the racial inequality work. And I think because that was successful, we'd be looking to mirror that approach.
Thank you.
I've got one important question, which you might not want to answer straight away, and a point I'd like to make, which is a bit more than a comment. I can't remember the planning application, so I don't want to attribute this to a particular building, but something came up in my ward where the developer has an obligation to provide homes for people with disabilities, for example. And my mind just tells me it at the time I saw it, but I wasn't there, I wasn't able to talk about it, that all the rooms for disabled people had single beds in them. Now, why is it that single people aren't allowed to have a partner, aren't allowed to have a sex life, for example? So again, it's more work for your department, but somebody needs to look at policies across the board, because I found that really quite shocking. I may be wrong, but that's my memory of it. And then the question that you might not want to answer straight away, although I think you have in a way, is do you have enough staff, and do you have the right staff, and what do you need in terms of your department to make it fly even more than it's flying at the moment?
Who's going to take that?
No, I'll let Elliot take, because
Okay.
I have been stressing this point quite a lot, so I'll let them answer then.
I'll take the second one. The second, it's actually an easier question, I think. So as it stands at the moment, you know, it is a small team. Celia has a part-time person working with her, but we have got additional resources, one more full-time role, so that we're just in the process of, we did actually have someone in place on a fixed-term contract to sort of look at whether that would be the right resource and whether the role was right. And we're now looking to recruit that on a permanent basis. So we will have 1.5 people working alongside Celia, and it is an area of work that actually our corporate graduates tend to be interested in, and Celia's quite good at grabbing them and saying, come and work with us for a 6-month stint. So, you know, we could say we've never got quite enough resources, but I think what we do want to try and make this is everyone's business. You know, so we don't want a huge equalities team. We never would. But actually, we want equalities embedded in everything we do. Now, there is an argument that sometimes you need to increase resources initially to try and make sure that is the case, to embed it across the organisation. But I think that's the journey that we would like to go on. You know, Celia is really good at sort of making a nuisance of herself and going along to things and making sure that people are talking and thinking equalities all the time. You know, we have our staff networks now, and they've really sort of made some differences, embedded themselves into how we work as an organisation, because this isn't just about the community, it's about us as an organisation as well. So I'd like to think we're on a journey. So the answer is we've got some more resources. We need to see how that pans out over the next year or so to see if that does feel right. But I think the real challenge is making sure that when everyone's going about their work, whatever that is across the organisation, they're thinking and acting in the right way when it comes to EDI.
Thanks for Elliot. That's perfect. And one of the other things that we have been pushing, and it is doing, and I know I'm not speaking out of turn, is because when I speak to my directors, for example, Victoria, and I've mentioned it to Mandy as well, within their massive organizational structure, they start thinking about making more Celias effectively, supported by Celia. And that is a kind of long-term vision. So where Elliot says it's been integrated, it truly is. And that is the kind of way forward in that.
Yeah, I would just add that it has to be like that, and only once it's embedded, then that's when you have a planning department that is making sure that they're challenging when they see something like that. I mean, I know Bristol Court, which we were very much involved in, you know, every stage of that development, they have extra care units, and people can be at Bristol Court in partnerships. And so I hope that we are making asking these questions, but there's always room for improvement and for challenge, and you know, people asking those important questions. But yeah, I think I do really feel like I'm sitting in more meetings that are about planning or about health or about, I mean, and it's good that you offer the challenge, you know, when we're talking about SEND, about, well, what's the equality impact and how come that's not being set out. So I think more and more we'll all be asking those questions, whether it's councillors, whether it's members of the community, providing that own ownership and challenge, or whether it's staff members and our senior leaders, just making sure that we're not forgetting certain groups.
And just on that point, Chair, it wasn't me criticising Celia for the missing information, as it were. I just noted that it wasn't there.
Sorry, did you want to say something, Celia? Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor Bidoff, for the question and also for the support. I just want to say a couple of things. First of all, to reassure you that I will pursue that question about homes for people with disabilities, as you know I would, and make sure that I understand what is the council's policy on that, and get back to you with an answer by the close of this week. The second part of it was just to let you know that since Mandy and Elliot have joined and I've moved into a different directorate, what has also happened is that there's been such a prominence given to EDI work that I'm now at everybody's SLT. And in fact, just today, finished a conversation with the Environment Department on looking at, and you've raised issues with me on transport and environment. And I've raised that with him about the need for the traffic and transport and for green economy to be more responsive to the EDI work. And we've just agreed a workshop to look at levelling up and how they can be more contributing to the levelling up agenda as a department. And disability groups have also raised, we have a disability age recovery partnership in the borough, which is led by Age UK and also the COPD team, also in the communities rather than the council. And they have now asked for a transport user reference group because they want to be more involved in transport related matters, but also in the public realm. So there's quite a lot of feedback from our public about, you know, their ability to influence council policy and decision, which I'm trying to make sure that they have a voice on the table, not at the end towards when we are going out to consult, but at the beginning. So there's some work that we're trying to do to reach the top of the team to make sure it's on that agenda. And same with Stephen Forbes as well. We've just had that discussion the day before on that. And finally, just to let you know that in terms of training, we've done some 11 courses online now for all staff, but also available to members, but it's certificated courses. And it's also going to be on Pantana to allow me to see how many people are completing the courses so that I can let the directors know that only 10% of your staff have completed the essential, only 3 are essential out of the 11. But for the 3, we do want to make sure that people have basic knowledge of reasonable adjustments, the legislation, what's required of you as a manager, etc. So 11 have been successful. Lots of people are going on it, and they don't have to come to me because I was just trying to optimize on my resource. So there's 11 courses up and running, including mental health, disability, gender, quite a few things on, and I'm constantly looking to update that as well, Councillor. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Celia. It seems there's a huge amount of stuff that you're all doing, which is great to see, actually. Councillor George or then Councillor Foote?
Well, you
Can I just say, maybe it's just my age, I don't know, but I mean, to me, the basic point that we're talking about is poverty. What causes that poverty is another question. I, for instance, was brought up post-war, and most of the poverty at that time was caused by fatherless families, where the father had died in the war. I mean, I recall in my school of children my age, of all my friends, only 2 of them had fathers. The rest of them were fatherless families. So, this wasn't just a few, this was the majority. And to put it into perspective, the war widow's pension was the equivalent of 50p a week. It wouldn't buy you a bottle of lemonade now, but I mean, and you had to, as growing up, you had to do things just to raise money. My mother, she had 3 children there at school age. She managed to get a job in the nursery as a cook because the children were at the nursery, so she was able to do 2 things at once. So all of these things sort of come back to the poverty of people. Now we know that when we look at bringing us more up to date with the racial groupings now, there are some racial groupings that seemingly are much better off than others. And I think Candice talked about the low-paid female workers at the airport. Nearly all of those working in catering, airline catering, which as soon as you stop flying aeroplanes, you don't need meals. So you start laying off your catering staff. They're some of the first to go, and they are the lowest paid. I know, because I spent a year as an airport trade union official working full time. Most of my members were in catering, so I know the problems that existed there and still exist there, because they are low paid, they are the most vulnerable. At least at one stage they were employed by the airline. Now they're not even employed by airlines. They're employed by other companies that are brought in to do the job. So they don't even get the perks of being able, if they're an Indian family, to be able to go back home to see relatives. So all of those things are changing. So it just worries me. Getting round to a question. I mean, and I'm picking it up in where it says risk management in the paper, because they're saying about we may not. Sorry, there is a risk that we may not achieve parity of focus and priority for all our equality groups due to limitations of resources. In mitigation, this may require a phased approach to developing and delivering priorities. All I can say is nothing's changed since the 1950s. Nothing's changed. It's still there. There's still the same problem. We don't have the resources to deal with the problem, and it's a massive problem. It's a bigger problem than the one that I faced as a child, because it's a much bigger community now than it was then. Hamworth was a village with just a few houses there, and quite old pre-war houses. So it's not like that. Hamworth is now a small town, really. So these things have changed in volume, but the basics are there, because the basic at the end of the day is poverty, and how do we overcome that poverty to be able to bring people up into a situation where they can support themselves and their families. So there is a question in there somewhere, I know, but
I can just quickly say, look, I totally get what you're saying. People say with the digital age, more technology, the inequality is reduced. We do things differently. We've got mobile phones, but you're right. The reality is still the same. There's still isolation. There's still all these people who live in overcrowding houses. So even though the world has changed post Second World War, with all of the advancements in technology, better cars, smoother cars, diesel, you name it, what we have expanded on, has that brought anything? This is a bit of a philosophical type question, but I think you've got to look at it in so many different ways. Celia, you're going to say something. I just wanted to just say that point.
I've got some thoughts on it, because when you were talking, Councillor Foote, I suppose it reminded me that when Celia and I were working on the cabinet report, which was sort of, I suppose, signposting the start of this, we were very keen to pay reference to other work that's going on, because you're right in terms of it's almost the holy grail of sort of sorting out poverty. I remember when I first started in Hounslow, Councillor Bath talked about it a lot. And if you look at what the council's doing at the moment in terms of, you'll have seen the paper on community wealth building that went to a recent cabinet meeting, the prosperity in place strategy. So I think the council realises that you've got to come from different angles. You've got to come from the community. You've got to come through business. We're looking at it here from the equalities lens to see which communities perhaps in particular or places need more specific interventions, to see if we can sort of target areas where we can maybe perhaps have a direct impact in how people's prosperity can be improved. But also there's the broader piece, I suppose, of interventions and work that the council is doing through its overall objectives to try and tackle the issues. But you can't come just through one lens. I don't think you have to come through all different aspects. But it is a real challenge, and it is complex. But we had a conversation yesterday, myself, Mandy, Celia, and a few colleagues around it. Going forward, it might not be enough to say we want organisations that we go into contract with or partner with to employ local people. We might actually say you've got to really target the communities where that will have a real difference. So they can't just be from Hounslow. We want you to really go deep into this and look into the communities that really would benefit from that employment, the ones who aren't getting chances in other ways. So from Hounslow might not be enough going forward.
I think it just worries me in saying in mitigation, this may require a phased approach to developing and delivering. You know, that seems to me to be a very slow approach. You know, that I can't see that getting up to a speed that's really going to start solving some of these problems in the lifetime of some of the people who are suffering them.
Yep.
Sorry.
So I think that is a really important point. What we want to do, though, is where we know there are interventions that can be implemented quickly and will have a result, we want to do those and we want to roll them out quickly, and be that addressing different factors in different parts of the borough where we've just said that some of the inequality is different. But I think you're right. Some of the interventions will take a long time because, as you've said, there's been generational factors that we need to address. And the point of the sort of process, I suppose, is how can we really get an understanding of both the short and the longer term interventions. But there are some other factors as well. So where there are sort of structural and systemic issues within, be that the community, be that within business, be that within our organisation, this process needs to identify those and we need to address them. And some of those things we need to address very quickly. I'm not saying there are, major issues around that, but we want the process to enable people to have a say so that they can identify themselves where there are those structural issues.
Thank you, Mandy. You're okay, Councillor
Yep,
Float.
yep.
Anything else? Councillor George, did you have a question?
I do, certainly. Thank you. I know Celia and the amount of work that she puts in, and I remember that since I am a foster carer, and I remember all the good times. Also being a volunteer on the Disability Forum, and I have seen clearly the positivity that you put in. I had two questions, and either way, I'm happy to say that we're taking a fresh approach and a commitment to develop a community that is fully inclusive, where our attitude underpin and is embedded into our strategy. I'm glad to see that. However, the questions I had, somehow they have been answered by other colleagues. Was what current challenges are you facing at the moment, specifically internally and externally? One of them. And secondly, how are we measuring our results, or how are we tracking our progress? That's all from me.
Thank you. Councillor Khan?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second one first and I'll let the others do the first one. So we've already started that work in terms of the measurability, hence why we had that traffic light system that we put in. I mean, we spent a lot of time.
Are we using artificial intelligence or humans?
So basically that evidence that we've done ward by ward in terms of all of the points that everyone has raised, from property to internet connectivity, how much debt people can carry. There's loads. There's quite a few. I've got the list here, but so that evidence was all put into a traffic light system, which is there ward by ward, that gives it, if it's green, orange, and red, would determine how the inequality in terms of the poor, as how people are poor. Like, for example, we know at the west of the borough there's more poverty than the east of the borough. But how do we know that? That was because of the work that we've already done. But some of that work will have to be redone because of the census information that's coming through again. Hence why this rolling analysis of what's going on. So we've already started that work, and we already know that. And a lot of that information comes from the data we have already. We already know the assets that we have in our locations in our borough, all the way from libraries to swimming pools to you name it, and to shops and buildings and business parks. There are assets in our borough we know how we can determine what we've got, and there's many others as well. So that evidence is there, and we've already started that work, and the traffic light system is kind of in place now, which needs developing. So it hasn't been plucked out of the air. We use that data, and they'll be updated once the census information comes in. So that's the kind of my answer to the second part. I'll let the others answer the first part and add to what I've said.
Thank you for the question, Councillor. First of all, I think in terms of the challenges, we're very clear what the challenges are. So we know that unemployment has increased as a result of the impact of COVID on Heathrow. Some of our sectors has shrunk. So we know that people working in certain sectors have been affected by it. We know that people owning micro businesses have been affected by the fact that, people have had to close. There's not been demand for services. So there's been both a business impact in terms of employment and the ability to sustain family and life. So we know that. We also know that the furloughing figures have then resulted in unemployment. So they were furloughed, but then they ended up now being unemployed. So it is the case that many people have to reskill. So what they might have had skills, they might have been relying on a certain set of skills at the airport or in those sectors have now got to be reskilled. So you can almost see what will the results be emerging is that there is a response to that. We also know that some parts of the borough don't have digital connectivity. I don't mean literacy, I mean connectivity. And because it's poor connectivity, it means that people then don't have access to going online, access to shopping, access to jobs. If everything's going online, then it begins to be a real problem for those communities who are not digitally literate. And we know quite a few of the wards, 4 wards in particular, are on the red in terms of digital connectivity, but also digital literacy. So there's got to be a true two-pronged approach around it. So our digital team are working. I think Councillor Bidoff talked about the digital inclusion group. They're working on that. They're working on making sure the connectivity is there for those 4 wards. So people are responding to the data sets that we are presenting across the organisation. The other piece of information is resident engagement. There's some groups are seldom heard precisely because digital access is difficult. And digital literacy is poor in certain communities. We also know that young people are in sectors like Deliveroo, retail, etc. And some of those sectors have also been hit, but it's very low pay. And because it's highly low pay, they can't access housing. There's a lot of, it has other implications, in terms of who's on low pay. So we've also got things like debt, very high in certain parts of the borough. So we've commissioned the CAB to do much more community-based, a bit like the community solutions conversation that in a narrative that Elliot gave us. So there's a focus on improving the provision of services from our third sector. So there's a lot going on in terms of here's the challenge and what will the results look like. So in terms of the levelling up agenda, some of the things that I'm hoping that we will begin to have a clear metric. So it's not woolly. So we all know that we've made that change as a result of this work, is we want to see narrowing the gap in health inequality. We want to narrow the gap in pay. And we want to narrow the gap in employment and opportunities for employment, whether you are west or east of the borough, it doesn't matter, but that you had access, because transport network is good, so that you can go from the west to the east or to central London to command the kind of wages you need to command. So then we've got living arrangements that we are looking at. So housing is looking at not just this affordable housing, because even with the best will in the world, if £22,000 is the average living household wage, that is not going to get you a mortgage. So we're looking at shared ownership more so that more young people can get on. So I'm engaging with housing to relook at what their offer is. So that's the kind of things that we're going to see. And Mandy alluded to it, and I think Elliot alluded to it as well, about the people who build homes in this borough, that they can actually be more engaged about what they can also offer for our residents. That part of our social value contract is a demand that they will employ local people and train local people so that they are in the construction sector, that there are pathways and a skills escalator for those communities as well. So there's a lot on in terms of, we do know what, and we are also working to get the right intervention to the challenges that we've identified. I hope that answers the question, Councillor.
It does indeed. Thank you.
Something to add, Elliot?
Yeah, I'd just like to add really that I think what Councillor George asked, what are the challenges? And I think what Celia has demonstrated is there's also a challenge. I took the question slightly differently. What are our challenges in terms of where do we focus? There's so much, and I think we have to be careful, or it would be useful in terms of talking to members through the work, through the task force, and then the extended group of members. Actually, where should we put some efforts quickly, like Mandy said, in where we can have big impact? Because it might well be, I'm not saying this is the case, that if we try to do everything, we might not do anything. But actually, if we choose on some areas where we think we can have big impact and follow the insight and the data, we might achieve some significant results for some communities across the borough.
So probably what Elliot said, totally agree. There's also long-term stuff as well, like the green recovery. That's another thing that we've been working on as a leadership team, is investing on the green recovery and the training and how we need to reskill people. So that again is another way of helping our vulnerable and poorly paid people to be retrained, to be able to take advantage of this new era of the green recovery.
Councillor Khan. Okay, we're now going to move on to the discussion, and if you have any comments to make, you may not do, but you may, then can you just please try and ensure that your comments are focused on the recommendations that are asked of us in the report, please. Anybody? Councillor Bidoff.
I'll probably make the first point last. This has thrown up for me even more work for Celia. I'm really sorry. One of the things that Celia mentioned was the multi-generational point, homes with many different people in them. And I'm not sure that we are looking at that across the board in enough of a way. I'm going to raise something which is tied with another point that you made, which was the literacy point. I mean literal literacy, not digital literacy, which was what I think you were referring to. And how much of that, is there an estimate? You may have an actual figure, but I suspect you haven't, of the hidden literacy that there is, illiteracy that there is in the borough. I'm thinking of a particular case in my ward where there's pressure on housing, and this is how it all knits in with other departments. There's pressure on housing. A family is living in ridiculously overcrowded state. There will come a time where the oldest child is asked to move out because they begin earning. That child, who's actually an adult age, but for illustrative purposes, is the route to her illiterate father's life. She reads everything to him. She fills in all his forms, etc., etc. There is pressure coming from one department to change your situation so that I can deal with the overcrowding position, but it's actually going to devastate the family. And I don't know to what extent you can estimate that that's a problem in the borough. Is it a small one? Is it a big one? Is it a general one? But I think I'm concerned about that extra aspect of it, which we haven't talked about, and to what extent your department needs to grow. And the multi-generational point comes into it as well. I wondered about languages. What do we do in terms of communicating with people in other languages? Because an awful lot of older generations don't speak English, and we have that across the board. You go canvassing, and during the day, the grandmother opens the door, can't communicate with you. Also says her husband makes her decisions for her, which is another problem that I think we need to get to grips with. On the earlier points, I think it's terrific that you're bringing in graduates to help you work, but every graduate comes in, needs to be trained, stays a short time, moves on, and so the whole process is repeated, and that takes an awful lot of time, presumably, of a very senior and very experienced member of staff, and it's fantastic training, I'm sure, but the balance has to be there. And just to end as a point of commonality from all of us is just to praise the department again and the extent of the work that it does. It seems to me that there are no boundaries. We can keep on adding to your workload, EV charging leads on one extreme. And we do need to keep a careful watch on how it operates. I understand that you're doing it through other departments, but we don't want Celia to have burnout. Thanks.
Councillor Bidoff.
Thank you, Councillor. That was an incredibly insightful point about multi-generational household and hidden literacy. I think it's not something we've picked up in our tackling inequality work, interestingly, despite the diversity of the borough. That the reason why we haven't is that there is no evidence source data. We've really struggled with knowing that. However, some data, which is the schools data, which tells us what the number of children with mother tongue for whom English is not the first language. And that's a bit of a clue. And we've used that as a basis to understand what support families need. Now, it's very interesting to be working with the Pakistani, the Bangladeshi, and the Bengali community in the borough. And again, really interesting in that they don't have funded people. It's all within their community, within the community, they help each other out. And so if there are professionals, they're the ones stepping up to advise and support those communities. So we are finding a pattern where young people are the carers. They've gone away from home. Exactly what you've said. It does mirror the kind of conversations coming back from the community, is that they are carers and they're burdened with quite a lot of work, and often the female member of the family, because mum or dad, English is not the first language. And it becomes difficult to navigate when it's NHS, when it's education. And we've got the same situation with Caribbean communities. Although English is a language, they're not familiar with or as confident with handling the LEA when it comes to truancy or exclusion rates or appeals and any of those kinds of things. So we in that kind of scenario, looking at mentoring and picking up young people who are able to offer mentoring to younger people, but also work with the parents. And that's just one tiny example of what we're working with the youth offending team. However, the bigger issue about lots of people picking up caring responsibility because their parents don't speak English, I think in some ways that's not going to go away. You think the second and third generation are amazingly highly qualified and they're now moving out, creating that kind of vacuum in the family. I know the NHS has a language line on offer. And we have discussed this in our sensory group, where we're getting GPs to use the language line to communicate, but this includes deaf residents as well, because again, they too struggle to engage and communicate. So there's a job of work around that. And a lot of young people are stepping up to that role, and some of them as very young people. So those are the issues about literacy, but we do offer adult ed literacy class. We do offer those things. But in my day, when I was much younger, I used to go into homes of people so that I could teach English in their homes as a volunteer. And the reason for that, women were not allowed out of their family home. And the implications of that was that they were so isolated and neglected in some sense because they couldn't come out to adult ed. So what we did was an outreach service to go out into women's home. And often it's very traditional conservative families that wouldn't allow women out. But by even giving them the grasp of how to go shopping, how to do basics, that's all you could achieve in that kind of situation. So I don't know whether adult ed still offers that, but I think with COVID, that's probably not have been a possibility. But those are areas that we've not looked at in our work. And levelling up, when I said it's phased, it means just that. For some communities, they're at a different place. And so the phasing will take a lot longer for us to even level up to, if we're saying there's a levelling up so that everyone's on an equal plateau, then the levelling up, it's the interventions going to be so stratified to reach different people, and it would take longer pathway to get to some of those communities. And we haven't really thought through how we might reach those communities except through the Bengali, the Pakistani through the groups themselves rather than the individual families and households. And so we've set up a Black and Asian minority ethnic consortium where we're looking at the impact of COVID on families and on impact of on employment, because we know with the Pakistani community we've had lots of issues around micro business where they are taxi firms or the Bangladeshi retail restaurants or something like that. They've all been hit quite hard. So we're working through those communities to look at how we might support them, including digital literacy, where we work with the younger generation and we make them part of a digital champion so that they would then get some certificate for working with the council, but at the same time they're teaching their grandparent how to be digitally literate. Just so what we've asked for is skills at being able to send an email, going onto the council's website and being able to pay something. So we've kind of identified three metrics that we'd like this young person. They'll be trained and they're then working with the household, within their own household, so that the grandma is happy and comfortable with the fact that this is a grandchild helping. But in the end of that, there will be, we're hoping that they will have some better access to apprenticeship schemes. So there's a bit of a carrot at the end of it. So there's a piece of work going on with the DIG team, the Digital Inclusion Group. And so those are kind of smaller projects that we're trying to reach out to households where literacy is a real problem. So we're going through these groups then. I hope that kind of, thank you, Councillor.
Just add a very small point, if I may. In this case, the father speaks fluent English, no different from anybody else in this room. It's reading and writing that he can't do. It's a bit like the Jay Blades. Did you watch Jay Blades of the Repair Shop and his learning to read at the age of 51? Yeah. The response of this father, though, to the daughter, not to me, was that he's given it 4 tries and his brain just won't let him learn. Yeah. So he's given up. I know it's a slightly different case, but that, again, it's these boundaries keep on changing and extending. But thank you very much for what you've said. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you both. Councillor Tuck, yes.
Thank you, Chair. There's a lot of good work going on in the background, and we've gathered enough data to start with. It'll be good if we have predefined timelines when we are measuring the progress, like every quarter or every 6 months, and bring in a report to the committee so that we can measure the progress, how and in which direction we are moving. Thank you.
So
we'll get back to that, because I think there's a schedule that needs to happen, because obviously we've had the reports on the 8th of Feb. There's another process to happen, but I think we'll ask the teams to get back to you on that, unless you know specifically, Elliot.
No, it's just that, if I use a strategy that's been implemented during the past year has been our Safer Communities strategy. And what that has each year, it has an action plan with it. And some of the issues that we said we would do that year. And also it has targets. Now, there's a natural place to update on a strategy such as that. It's the Community Safety Partnership Board. So we need to think of the right place and I suppose the right forum to take the progress of this strategy. So not defined as yet, but certainly something that we'll come back on.
Something, or Elliot? Does anybody? Oh, I'm so sorry, Elliot. I was just talking to Councillor Foot. Okay. Councillor Foot, do you have a comment, or do you want to?
No.
No comment. Okay. So do you just want to?
Everybody's finished then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Really, sorry.
Oh, your mic.
Oh. Tells you how old-fashioned I am. I learned to shout before I learned to speak on a mic. Right, sorry, yeah. Really, the motion is really looking at considering the comments on the process and the approach to developing the council's new equality, diversity, inclusion strategy. And I think that we would be asking the cabinet to continue with that and certainly to continue with the processes that the officers have outlined. And hopefully, because this is not a done deal, so we're expecting, whoever takes over from us, whether any of us will be here, I don't know, but that there will in fact be more reports in the future coming forward to tell us of where we're going. I think, as I underlined, this isn't a new thing. It's been around a long time, and it's going to take a long time to disappear. So I think that it's important that we keep things on it. So that's really the basis of the motion.
Thank you, Councillor Foot. All in agreement with that? Good, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you to Councillors Atherton and Khan, and to Celia and Elliot and Mandy for your time this evening. And as I say, you're free to stay to the end if you wish, or you're free to leave. Okay, we now come into agenda item 5, which is actually quite an exciting one. I think we're going to have progress reports from scrutiny panels. Unfortunately, Councillor Cornwall Chowdhury is not able to be here this evening, so I know Councillor George is going to do that for her. Do you want to go first, or Councillor Lal, any particular? Yeah, okay, thank you, Councillor Lal.
Okay, Chair. The Health and Adults Scrutiny Panel has considered care homes and sheltered housing over the year and has heard evidence from officers, voluntary sector and care home managers. The panel has heard about the efforts during the COVID pandemic, worked on activities for residents, as well as some future challenges for the sector, such as recruitment. The panel last met on Monday, the 7th of March, to discuss the recommendations, which will be shared wider when it's been finalized. The recommendations centered on the ownership structure of the care home sector, the support offered by the council, and how to build on the work done during the pandemic. Summary.
Thank you very much, Councillor Lal. Councillor George, do you want to do yours first, or Councillor Chowdhury?
Yeah, I'm happy to do Councillors Cornwall Chowdhury. So
That's
I'll
fine.
give a presentation for Cornwall on the housing scrutiny panel. The panel met on Monday, the 14th, a day before this, to discuss the recommendation that we were building on the work of the panel over the whole year. The topics over the year was housing allocations, and the discussions around recommendation, the centered around staff, residents, and the process, with some topics being discussed, including those on the housing register that we are communicated with, what kind of updates we did, the frequency of it, and the role of protected characteristics in the application process, and the training for the staff. Last night we decided on the recommendation, and they're still to be shared after they finalized and given to the officer to have a look at it. That's all from the housing, and I'm happy to give mine. Chair, are you okay with that? Okay, so thank you everyone for all the work you did and you put through all the past year. I appreciate that. The Children and Young People panel, scrutiny panel, has had all 4 meetings on the deep dive into the impact of COVID on the education, mental health of the Children and Young People panel in our borough, right? The panel has had presentations from 2 head teachers, and probably members, you do remember that, and a voluntary sector organization, Rihanna, if you remember, yeah? Excuse my voice. And also engage with the Children and Young People panel and the parents and the carers via an online survey, which received around 119 responses, plus Instagram polls, which our lovely Svetlana worked in the background. And I would like to say thank you to her. I know she probably left the team, but Svetlana, am I right, Paul? Yes. Right. And it's right. So coming back to the Instagram polls, which attracted 279 responses. At the same time, the panel also heard a presentation from the clinical director of CAMS, Mr. Johan Redelingis. Excuse my spelling of the name. I always have a problem with that. Who is the West London NHS Trust director, and then a presentation on the results of our online engagement. At our fourth and last meeting, which took place last week, on Thursday, 10th of March, we discussed our recommendations, which we are hoping to be very impactful as possible as it can be. The panel is currently working on the wording of the recommendations before they're shared more widely. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillors Lal and Councillor George. Well, obviously it's our last meeting today, so thought it was very important to have an update from the scrutiny panels, which do or have a deep dive every year. So I hope you found the updates interesting, and if you do have any questions, I'm sure the panel chairs will be happy to answer them outside of the meeting. Yes. Good. Okay. The final item this evening is actually just for information, and it's simply because everybody always seems extremely keen to talk about recycling. So I hope you will all just note the report. Noted. Noted. Thank you very much. Are there any urgent matters? I presume that's a no.
I need to wish everybody luck and hopefully keep well in this upcoming.
Yeah, I would just like to say thank you to each and every committee member. Some of them are not present. We haven't got Councillor Mashisho tonight, Councillor Chaudhry and Councillor Luki, and of course, we haven't got Councillor Akanzada with us, who is an integral part of our committee. But I really hope, well, like I said, I'd like to thank all of you because everybody has, I think, challenged, questioned. Councillor Biddulph, I'll come to you at the end. No, I'd just like to thank you all. I think we've all done a great job. I think we, at the beginning, there's always teething problems, but I think we have all worked well together. And, I'm really grateful. And of course, thank you very much to Paul for your constant support. And Rachel, you just joined us at the beginning and it was wonderful to have you along. And to Chaz for your brilliant, clerking the whole time. And of course to Gary, let me not forget Gary. And last but not least, I would really like to thank my wonderful Vice Chair, Councillor Foote, who has been so supportive, and really thank you, Councillor Foote, and thank you to everybody. So good night, and Councillor Biddulph, you may speak.
Thank you, Chair. Sometimes the outgoing chairman recommends to an incoming chairman subjects that need to be looked at. So I just wanted to put an idea on the table, which is learnings from the pandemic. Just as an example, I mean, I know that's as broad as it's long, as it's wide, as it's deep, etc. But I just think something about ways in which it's changed the council, moved it on. It's been a disruptor, hasn't it? Disruptors always lead to new outcomes and better outcomes. But also some very small points will come out as well, I hope, such as things like the food bank, etc. Thanks.
Kuldeep, sorry, did you, Sir Councillor Dunn? Yes. I'm sure nobody wants to listen to me anymore. So thank you all for your time this evening. And this is the shortest and quickest one we've had, isn't it? Indeed it is. So we've broken a record tonight. Thank you. Councillor George?
Yes, just to add up and to say thank you to Teresa, who left our team. I just want to say that I'm impressed by the work she put in. And also to my officer, Nicola, because it's great. All the support I received, I wouldn't be able to do it without her. And also, not the last but the least, would be to say, we are standing in solidarity with our brothers and sisters in Ukraine. So that's all from me.
And I suppose the last thing we should say actually is you become so aware of the amount of work done by the officers and everybody within the department. I mean, it's just, as you said, how big, how wide. I mean, it's just endless. So thank you to everybody. Thank you. Good night.